So my name, some of you know, is Jafari Sinclair Allen, Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies and the Director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, or IRAAS, in the new Department of Ads. And it's my pleasure to welcome and honor, it is a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of my colleagues and students in our wider community to this instant of our Conversations series. Now situated within the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, established in 2018, Columbia's Institute for Research in African American Studies has been a prominent public-facing Black Studies research institution, bridging scholarship, teaching, and public life for 30 years. Founded by Manning Marable, the Institute has positioned Columbia faculty as leading interpreters of the urban Black experience in neighboring Harlem and beyond. However, its foundation reaches back much further, including, for example, to pioneering anthropologist Franz Bois and Zora Neale Hurston, whose literary and ethnographic work is a touchstone for study and reflection on Black diaspora. Professor Marable established the Conversations series as a forum for the discussion of books and ideas that matter, intellectually and politically. Tonight is no exception. We are here to engage the new publication of a singular scholar whose deeply invested transnational work, I had three espressos and now a tea, so you'll have to excuse me. Here to engage the new publication of a singular scholar, Juliet Hooker, whose deeply invested transnational work has shifted paradigms in Black studies and political science. Juliet Hooker is Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence in Political Science. She's a political theorist specializing in racial justice, Black political thought, Latin American political thought, democratic theory, and contemporary political theory, whose work has already brilliantly illumined issues of citizenship, democracy, and Black indigenous belonging in Nicaragua and the wider Americas, and diasporic connections and comparisons among Black thinkers. Previous to last year's Princeton University's publication of Black Grief, White Grievance, The Politics of Loss, she published Theorizing Race in the Americas, Douglas, Sarmiento, Du Bois, and Vasconcelos in 2017, which won the American Political Science Association's 2018 Ralph Bunche Book Award, and Race and the Politics of Solidarity in 2009, both by Oxford University Press. She's also editor of Black and Indigenous Resistance in the Americas, From Multiculturalism to Racist Backlash. In her new work that we will celebrate and engage tonight, Black Grief, White Grievance, The Politics of Loss, she shows, quote, how race shapes expectations about whose losses matter, end quote. As we will see, drawing on African American political thought, Black Grief, White Grievance speaks in a voice that Roger Smith praised as, quote, soberly elegant, demonstrating a set of refusals grounded in Black women's epistemologies and Black feminisms, such as white refusal that's not part of Black women's epistemologies, white refusals and its cost for democracy, and Black women's epistemologies and Black feminism's refusal of the imperative to make Black loss public and visible, and finally, quote, grieving activism that refuses to instrumentalize grief and bear the burden of activism, end quote, which is related to a Black political resistance to what she calls political heroism. Professor Hooker will favor us with a very short excerpt from the book, after which I will ask just a few questions to lead into a wider conversation with all of us. So please join me in welcoming Professor Juliet Hooker.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to Professor Allen and everyone at ADS and IRAAS at Columbia for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks to Sharon and everyone else for making my visit so smooth. I'm going to read some excerpts from the book, and just to give you a little bit of a sense of not all parts of the argument, but some of the broader certain claims that I think will be of interest. So I'm just going to jump in. The sacrifices expected of Black citizens are an activist for the sake of white democracy are part of a long-standing historical pattern. The protests against police violence led by the Movement for Black Lives, continue a long tradition of Black political mobilization catalyzed by Black death as a result of white violence subsequently channeled into public mourning, as was the case with the NAACP's use of lynching photographs to mobilize public outrage against post-Reconstruction era racial terror in the early 20th century, or the funeral of Emmett Till as a catalyst for the civil rights movement in the 1950s. In the words of Latricia Weidman, who was a sister of Jacob Blake, who was famously shot by police officers with his kids in the car in Kenosha, quote, "So many people have reached out to me telling me they're sorry this happened to my family. Well, don't be sorry, because this has been happening to my family for a long time, longer than I can account for. It happened to Emmett Till, Philando, Mike Brown, Sandra, and I've shed tears for every single one of these people that it's happened to. This is nothing new. I'm not sad, I'm not sorry, I'm angry, and I'm tired. I haven't cried one time. I stopped crying years ago. I am numb. I have been watching police murder people that look like me for years. I'm also a Black history minor. So not only have I been watching it in the 30 years that I've been on this planet, but I've been watching it for years before we were even alive. I'm not sad. I don't want your pity. I want change." End quote. For democratic theorists who extol witnessing as a key civic capacity, it is not a passive bystander activity. Instead, it's an active form of truth-telling and listening to the pain of others that might enable agonistic exchange and collective meaning-making. Weidman's painful testimony, however, reminds us of the costs of witnessing. As Elizabeth Alexander has observed, and Weidman's invocation of seeing racial violence for years before she was even alive illustrates, racial violence imposes compulsive witnessing on Black citizens. Yet the contemporary scholarship on mourning and democracy has tended to frame Black public grief in a reparative vein that situates it almost solely as a solution to democratic deficits. This has the paradoxical effect of minimizing ongoing and continuing loss. Conceptions of mourning as a democratic resource are an inadequate approach to Black grief. If we are to truly attend to Black grief, we can hold on to witnessing only mournfully and tentatively without romanticizing it. Black citizens are called on to repetitively witness for the sake of repairing the wrongs of white democracy, and they're also expected to protest only in the most civil, non-disruptive ways in order for their losses to be legible. Refusals to contain Black rage are said to be counterproductive because they alienate potential white allies. Yet such criticisms are based on a number of mistaken assumptions about the history of Black activism. This is especially true of the dominant official romantic narrative of the civil rights movement in the United States, which emphasizes its commitment to nonviolence and civility rather than its more confrontational tactics. What is often left uninterrogated in critiques of uncivil forms of Black protest, moreover, are the very conditions of possibility for the production of white empathy, which is not the same as political solidarity. To have empathy is to be able to see and identify with the pain or suffering of others. Empathy can therefore remain in the realm of feeling without implying action, and it can also depend on seeing the other as like oneself in some fundamental way. In contrast, political solidarity doesn't depend on pre-political bonds and requires taking action to redress injustice. Democratic equality, which is possible only in the context of racial justice, requires much more than white empathy and should not depend on constrained Black political action, which is itself an unjust civic burden. But this labor of mobilizing Black grief for the sake of a broader racial justice has been taken up in some instances by Black citizens themselves. So the challenge in their case is to recognize how the notion of redemptive suffering, the idea that by engaging in exemplary forms of political activism that make Black pain visible, white public opinion will be transformed has constrained Black politics, I argue. Private grief turned public mourning has been a central feature of Black politics because historically, Black grief has been largely invisibilized. In response to profound losses that are not publicly acknowledged, Black communities have mobilized around spectacular moments of loss when it has been possible to make Black grief legible. One result of this is the difference in public attention to those killed by police violence compared to the slow deaths caused by everyday disasters that disproportionately affect communities of color, such as environmental racism. The imperative to channel grief into activism that has been the dominant approach to loss in African American political thought and politics can function to conscript Black grief into the project of repairing white democracy, though important strands of the tradition have refused this aspiration. Political theorists, meanwhile, have worried that focusing on political loss will lead either to paralysis or to what Bonnie Honig calls the lamentation of politics, abandoning the pursuit of power. For Black politics, however, the problem has been a parasitic approach to Black activism as a source of democratic energy and renewal. That is how it has been approached by those who want to use it to repair white democracy. To the extent that Black grief is approached as a salve for white democracy without addressing justice, it perpetuates expectations of Black sacrifice that constrain Black political agency. Black feminist thinkers, however, in particular, have developed complex approaches to loss that go beyond the imperative to channel grief into activism. And so I want to read a little bit now from chapter 3 in the book, which is an extended meditation on the work of Harriet Jacobs and Ida B. Wells to talk about how they are a model for how we might resist some of these expectations. Like Toni Morrison and W.B. Du Bois, Harriet Jacobs and Ida B. Wells also grappled with the dilemma of what to conceal or disclose about Black suffering in order to make Black loss visible. At a historical moment when we are bombarded with viral videos of Black people dying, which are shared in the name of demanding democratic witnessing of Black pain to elicit racial redress, Jacobs and Wells remind us of the ethical dilemmas that attend to representations of Black suffering. Their work is deeply relevant to a contemporary moment because it reminds us that it is possible to balance grief and grievance in accounts of loss. Wells and Jacobs show us how to tell stories of Black life, not just Black pain or Black death. And I'm going to read a little bit from my analysis of Ida B. Wells. While Wells's texts on lynching and white race riots undoubtedly foreground the Black dead, the violated and pained Black body, white violence, and white rage, she also repeatedly tells the stories of the lives of the Black victims and their families, such that her work itself becomes a site of grieving for Black loss. Wells narrativizes Black suffering even as she presents herself as an impartial purveyor of facts in order to navigate the skepticism of white readers primed to dismiss accounts of white violence and Black loss. Even in Wells's emblematic texts on lynching and white race riots, there is an accounting of Black lives. In A Red Record, for example, where most of the text is devoted to presenting statistical data about lynching, she nevertheless reanimates the life before the lynching. The chapter titled Lynching Imbeciles, which tells the stories of Hamp Biscoe in Arkansas and Henry Smith in Texas, doesn't include the names of the two male victims in the chapter subheadings. But in the text, Wells shares that Biscoe was a hardworking, thrifty farmer, that he had a 13-year-old son and wife, that his wife was pregnant, that she had a babe at the breast when the family was killed, and that the white men who killed all but the breastfeeding baby took $220 from Mrs. Biscoe's stockings after they killed her, among other details. Similarly, Wells's pamphlet on an infamous early 20th century white race riot, the East St. Louis Massacre of 1917, which prompted a congressional investigation, is textually dominated by her compilation of the life stories of the Black victims. Unlike a red record, in which chapter titles and subheadings reference event types rather than individual victims, so they are lynching of innocent men, lynched because the jury acquitted him, and lynched as a scapegoat, for example, that's a red record. Most of the chapters in the East St. Louis massacre are named after the Black victims whose stories they tell. These chapters tell the individual life stories of the Black victims, and their titles reflect this. Mrs. Ballard's story, Mrs. Lulu Thomas's story, Clarissa Lockett's story. Before the Contemporaries Say Her Name campaign to name Black women killed by police officers and bring attention to the fact that they're also victims of state violence, Wells employed the same strategy to reanimate Black lives lost to white violence. She told their stories and said their names. Wells builds a litany of loss with each successive chapter on an individual victim in the East St. Louis massacre. She provides an incredible amount of quotidian detail about the Black lives lived before the riot, thereby forcing her readers to grapple with the losses, both psychological and material, it produced. For example, in Mrs. Willie Flakes' story, she writes, quote, Mrs. Flake is a widow with 3 children, 11, 8, and 6 years old. She is a laundress who came to East St. Louis 4 years ago from Jackson, Tennessee. She took care of her little family by taking in washing, and she worked from Monday morning until Saturday night at the ironing board. She too had 3 rooms full of nice furniture, both of the 2 front rooms having nice rugs on the floor, a brass bedstead, and other furniture to correspond. She had about $100 worth of furniture ruined, $50 worth of clothing, and about $50 more of bedding, mattresses, etc. The mob had taken a phonograph for which she had paid $15, and 25 records for which she had paid 75 cents and $1 each. In this passage, Wells captures grief and loss without resorting to overtly emotional language. Noting the exact price of the musical equipment is a way to mark the riot's economic impact, but it also prompts us to imagine Mrs. Flake listening to music with her children, perhaps even taking a break from washing and ironing to dance or sing along to one of the 25 records she had purchased with her hard-earned wages. Mrs. Flake's losses and those of her children are also of safety and a home painstakingly built. Wells combines a laser-like focus on compiling a factual record of anti-Black violence with a detailed accounting of the Black lives appended or foreclosed by that violence. For most of her white readers, who were unaccustomed to extending the same care and concern to Black people, the detailed lists of material goods lost could read as mere statements of fact, to be sure. But for those who had developed the civic capacity to care about the losses of racialized others, and for Black audiences, these inventories of dispossession were profoundly effective. Wells marshaled facts enumerating Black loss to produce affect. She balanced grief and grievance and fact and affect across and within text to tell the full story of Black loss. And her writing itself becomes a site of mourning for the losses she chronicled. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I had lots of questions, but I think I wanted to begin. I thought that we would begin around disciplinarity, but I'm struck again as you read this about this first order naming. And I of course think of Hortense Spillers when I think of in American Grammar book about this need to name and enumerate, right? Being perhaps for some of us one of the features of a Black feminist analysis, but also it seems to me that the arguments in your book could also be taken to be another sort of proposal for Black studies social science. Mm-hmm. is it? You just sort of put that in there, subliminally, so that, yes, I'm talking about politics and I'm talking about the ways this, but it also could be about how we ought to describe. Is this a corrective of Black political science on the low?
No, you're trying to get me in trouble. I think it could be taken that way. I think when I started the project, I wasn't necessarily thinking about Black political science, although it is true that we can say, a lot of Black political science is about enumeration in a certain way. But I think what I was, in terms of the question of how I was trying to think about political science and political theory in particular, the critique actually is aimed at political theorists who tend who want to write about mourning as something that can be productive for democracy. And they often turn to Black grief and mobilize it as an exemplary form of mourning. And that, of course, stands in very stark contrast to the work that's being done in Black studies, where, so many people are sort of pushing back on and saying, there are all of these losses that can't be accounted for, and how do we sit with that loss? And so part of what the book, I think, is trying to do is to say to the folks in political theory, like, look at how you're actually instrumentalizing Black grief, and what happens if you actually put yourself in conversation with folks in Black studies and the ways in which folks in Black studies are trying to think about Black death and Black life. But I do think, one of the things that the book is also trying to do is not to, I'm not prescribing, the right form of activism, but I am noting some of the consequences of some of the ways in which we've engaged in what we might call grieving activism, right? So often the impulse in or the way in which people try to make loss visible is by quantifying, right? So if you think about 100,000 deaths from AIDS, or 100,000 deaths from, or we're in the millions now from the coronavirus, right? Like, that's a way that people try to make people see loss. But there are obviously limits to quantifying. And so often there's also the move to say, how do we remember people not just as part of these, these large numbers, but as human beings? And I think what's really interesting about Wells is that we see her doing both. And we see her kind of doing what we might call, a form of social science, but also in a way that's really humanistic, even, she's using, so part of the argument in that chapter is that she's using a variety of tools, and that we miss that if we try to place her too much into one of these disciplinary categories.
Now I have 10 more questions, but I wanted to, because you talked about picturing it, and one of the things that I found, and I started to pull out some of the interludes, the way that you weave in some poetry and photography and sort of descriptions of everyday life, and the photographs. The photographs that depict these scenes that have been used to elicit certain feelings. And I wanted to, in case people haven't had a chance to read the book, which is for sale at the back of the room from our lovely friends at Book Culture. Wave your hand. There you go. It's right there for you. I just wanted to share this with folks here, a couple of these photographs. And so I think folks remember this one, and if you would choose whatever to talk about. This one was especially.
That's a lynching photograph.
This lynching was especially arresting to me because I resist those photographs. There was maybe 10 or 12 years ago an exhibit at the Schomburg, and I couldn't do it. I could barely get through the door, right? And starting of course with Trayvon, the repetition of Black death in video and on television, and this choice to black that part out, I think is very telling. And then there's this one, right, with John Lewis as the bridge. The cartoon is called The Bridge, and this one, when you say a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? And of course, I was telling Juliet I got the wrong photo. So Juliet writes about the first time that Stacey Abrams appeared on the cover of, and it was Time?
Vogue, I believe.
It was Vogue, and she had a beautiful dress, but she also had a cape, and it said, "Can Stacey Abrams save America?" But then here, 2 years later, this is 2021, and it says, "Can she save it again?" Now, are we going to have Stacey? They're gonna pull Stacey out
2024.
In 2024.
Can Stacey do it a third time?
Right, and of course, this famous photograph that you talk about. So if you could, so there's that. But then I've been thinking also about these photos, right? So this one, and this is the segue to wanting to talk to you about what I think is your tremendous contribution of work in Latin American politics and Black Latin American studies, the connection between the current immigrant crisis in this country and in New York in particular, and a photo like this. So we're used to seeing unhoused Black folks in photos, right? And people may be inured to that image. This image is of Senegalese brothers, and anybody who's been down 116th Street has seen the explosion, or anyone who's had anything delivered to their home from Uber Eats, et cetera, you've seen the increase in these brothers, and I say that because it's largely male. What does this image? What sort of politics is evoked, or what sort of sentiment is supposed to be evoked by this? And of course, this one where movements for Black trans lives, or movements for trans lives, or the attempt to elicit some empathy for the sickening number of Black and brown trans women who have been killed. What has it evoked? So part of this is also about who they are aimed at. What's the things that you show is that the ideological valence may be quite different. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk about any one of these that you have used in the book, or any of the others. What your thoughts are?
So there's a lot there. So I'll start by saying this. One is that the larger argument of the book is about thinking about political loss, right? Thinking about loss and how it functions politically and how people mobilize in response to it. And the overarching argument is that Black grief and white grievance are two ways in which people are mobilizing around loss right now, and that they're two of the important forces driving racial politics in the United States today. But I think that the analysis of political loss also leads us to think about questions as in that chapter where I talk about Wells and Jacobs, but in others about this question of whose losses are immediately visible. Whose losses are we attuned to see, and who are the communities whose losses we are not attuned to see, right, and who therefore have to do this extra work to try to make it legible. But that extra work also involves these perilous choices, right? So you're trying to get people to see your loss so that they will, change course, so that they will attend to it. But that often means, right, that we're asking people to prove their humanity in order for us to care about their suffering. And proving their humanity often means proving that they're like us, right? And then that gets you into the whole range of what are the patterns in who is grievable and who does the grieving. Right. You know, and in the fourth chapter of the book, when I look at, you know, this historical pattern of Black maternal grief, one of the things that, as you point out, that I talk about is how the gendering of that, right? And how it's set up so that Black women are the grievers, Black men are the grieved, and where does that leave queer Black folks? But also, where does it leave, you know, thinking about the Trayvon Martin case, where somebody like Rachel Jeantel isn't legible in a way because they weren't, right? You know, she wasn't a mother, they weren't married, she wasn't a wife, they were kids, you know, and there's this way in which I think this whole question of you know, of also requiring people not just to prove their humanity, but to be the perfect victim, to be innocent, right, in order for their losses to register. So I think there's a whole set of questions that I think about in the book that, you know, that are about this, the way in which, you know, loss is actually working inner politics, and the way in which grief and grievability are working through what we see as political problems and what we don't, right? And I guess the last thing that I'll say about the, you know, the images that you showed about the contemporary migrants and how we might think about that is that the other part of the book, right? I think I've talked a lot about Black grief as white grievance, and thinking about one of the arguments in the book is about how this white grievance is often an anticipatory form of loss, right? It's this these kind of apocalyptic visions of what's going to happen if you know, if there's demographic change, if we have more immigrants, right? So even the language of an immigrant invasion, right? Like the U.S. is being taken over, you know, by this invading army of immigrants, which isn't happening, hasn't happened. But also imagining that as white subjugation, right? That is where it goes, right? So when we think about, I think, the way in which we think about the way in which the discourse around immigration, I think, is very much fueled by these sense of that some people are feeling of being displaced from the center of U.S. politics. But the interesting thing about, you know, the fact that, because I'm from Central America, and Central America has become the route through which many of these migrants now enter into the United States, and many of them are from African countries. And, you know, the thing that is creating when, you know, you're in the airport in Nicaragua and suddenly you're surrounded by a lot of African men. Yeah. Which, and in a country that has historically denied the presence of Blackness, right? So I'm also wondering about not just how they're perceived here, but how folks are processing their presence there as they move through on their way to the U.S.
Right. I talked to this a Haitian small family that a couple of years ago who came through Mexico and arrived in Miami, another place that is used to these movements, but not used to these large numbers of Black people coming in a way, because the wave was not the wave that people expected, right? People have been amassing in different areas and moving and trying to get to a place through really these really harrowing circumstances. But I did think about space, thinking through immigration also, because in your first book, you know, you really talk about how the autonomous region, the Caribbean coast, is the place for indigenous, and I'm doing that because you want to look the other way, the space for indigenous for the indigenous and for the Creole and Black, and then the Pacific Coast is the real Nicaragua or Managua.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered how reading this is so grounded in African American thinking, in African American circumstance, how you are thinking through the connection between the first two projects.
That's a very good question. I mean, I think more so than either one of my two previous books, this is a much more U.S. focused book than I've done before. And I think, and part of it actually came about, I first started writing what would become one of the chapters in the book, which is looking at Black protests and how it has been policed and constrained. And I started writing that after Ferguson. And I was actually in Nicaragua and watching.
Oh, you were watching from?
Watching it right on Facebook, back in the day. And I was teaching a study abroad program, and then having to go and this sort of disconnect between what was happening and a certain remove that so many people were feeling. And so I think part of what initially made me start working on this book was trying to make sense of the way in which, the grief and pain and rage of the protesters in Ferguson was in some ways misunderstood or being critiqued at the time. And then the 2016 presidential campaign happened, and the sort of explosion in sort of misogyny, xenophobia, et cetera. And so I think it became a book about U.S. racial politics, and it's whereas the book I had written prior to that was really a hemispheric book where I was trying to put African American and Latin American thinkers in conversation. And so I think what I would say is I think some of that while the book is focused on the U.S. and draws primarily on the work of African American thinkers, that some of the arguments transcend the specific geographic and historical context, right? And that if you look at something, for example, like grieving activism, which is often, some of our iconic examples of it are maternal activism.
Just women in white, yeah.
But if you think about it in the Latin American context, right, there are all of these examples from the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo to the parents of the Ayotzinapa students kidnapped in Mexico, where maternal activism has been a kind of central theme. And then I think also this question of, in the wake of, military, very violent military dictatorships and other forms of violence, I think you have a set of questions there that are similar to some of the ones that are now, that people are trying to grapple with in the US, which is how do you deal with unjust, violent pasts when those pasts have been perpetrated by the state? Right. How do you remember them? How do you contest them? How do you challenge them? And how do you do it while, I think, also paying attention to the ways in which, activists are doing this work, and it's heroic, but it has a toll, and what are we asking of people?
That's a good place to not go to my 15 other questions, but to bring it to other folks who I'm sure have things to ask and to say to you. But before we do that, is there something else that you wanted to say before we open it up?
I think maybe I just want to explain a little bit about the photograph, the lynching photograph, since you talked about it. So that I write about that in the chapter on Ida B. Wells, and I write about it because in the chapter I make a contrast between the way in which the NAACP would go on to use lynching photography as a part of their anti-lynching activism, and the way in which Wells does it. Wells is actually the first to use lynching photographs to convince the public, the disbelieving public, that these things were actually happening. She uses them when she goes on tour in the UK, and audiences are like, no, that can't be happening. And so then she uses the photographs, and she says they're convinced against their will, essentially. And the interesting thing to me about what the NAACP would go on to do is that, as you see this is from a pamphlet, right, where they're describing this lynching, but the facts of the lynching kind of fade away, and the pamphlet says, don't look at the Negro because his suffering is over. Look at the ways in which the white children surrounding him, how they're being, distorted and harmed, right, by being forced to participate in this act of violence. And the white children kind of become stand-ins for U.S. democracy, which is being disfigured by these outbursts. So for me, that's an example of the way in which we can, an example of, a campaign that was trying to, of course, eradicate lynching, but then moves the onus of, of attention onto the harms that are being perpetrated on U.S. democracy as a whole and away from the Black victims. And that's very different from how Wells goes about it.
Thank you. One of the other things that people who don't know should know, that you ask, why did people take pictures anyway? And it should be noted that these were souvenirs.
Right.
This was not originally done to document, but to trade and to send to your friend, right? They were objects of pleasure.
Yes.
Right. So, let's begin. Yeah.
I'll jump in. Juliet, I love this book. And I want to start by thanking you for writing it. It's a book that created so many additional lingering questions in very good ways. And so one question, I think you get at this with anticipatory loss, but I just wanted to see how you thought more about this, and if you had an additional conversation that you would carry around this question, which is, so one of the things that kind of kept popping up in my mind as I was reading this book was in sort of almost in juxtaposition to the concept of loss. What do we make of the concept of gain? Mm-hmm. So, like I said, anticipatory loss kind of gets at this. It's also complicated because you show us the different ways you're thinking about, and you're pulling from, and you're defining loss. And the primary way that you're defining loss is in a way that is not zero sum. So there is nothing to be gained from an ethical and metaphysical standpoint from the loss of a Black life. But at the same time, politically, you could argue that there are things that are gained politically by the Black loss. And so I wanted to know what you thought more about the concept of gain, where gain fits into our larger understanding of American politics, democracy, as something, again, that sits juxtaposed to this concept of loss.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I think what I would say two things. One of them is that, as you pointed out about the lynching photography, part of what I think we discount when we make these arguments that making people's suffering visible will lead people others to empathize with it is that we discount the extent to which people derive pleasure from domination and from participating in it vicariously. And I think part of my analysis of white grievance is that we have often, I think, attributed it to economic precarity, right? That it's about economic anxiety, it's about fears of economic loss, but that often it's these symbolic losses that seem to be driving people in particular and mobilizing people in terms of great degrees of racial resentment. And I think that right, if you think about something like, the people who are up in arms about diverse Hollywood casting, or who are mad that, a Confederate statue got taken down, or, something that really is not creating any tangible benefits for Black people, but people are still incredibly upset about it. But I think there are these questions about, cultural representation, but it's also about these ways in which these symbols are reassuring to people. They reaffirm, right, their place in the social political hierarchy. And so part of the question of the importance of, I think, thinking about this is that, when we look at why folks might be attracted to somebody like Trump, right? It's the pleasure of engaging in domination, of feeling like you're exerting power over others, and precisely in these most really what's that I'm blanking, but the point is that creating the pain is the point, right? That is what people are gaining pleasure from. And so I think what I would say is that the interesting thing of thinking about that is the way in which these things that aren't really gains for people of color are nevertheless experienced as losses by some white folks. And then on the other side of it, right, the ways in which we might think, right, that people would turn away from scenes of Black suffering. But as you were pointing out, it could be reassurance, right? So the drumbeat of videos of Black people being violently killed could be reassuring to somebody who feels like they're being displaced, that you are still, you are still at, not somebody whom this is happening to, and therefore your place in the U.S. social structure is secure. And so that's why I think we need to be, often people, I think, make these calls after, for the display of pain or Black bodies. I love Claudia Rankin, and I cite her multiple times in the book, but she had this moment after the Charleston massacre where she said we should display their bodies. And she said we should do that because it would be proof that these claims that, for example, police officers have, that they're of the superhuman Black person who's attacking them, that they used to justify their violence, that's not true. But I think the point that you're getting at, Jonathan, and that I agree with, is that actually we have to think about the fact that this might not be the effect that these images are having.
And that's when this began, the Trayvon Martin, these images, I of course went directly to Elizabeth Alexander's "Can You Be Black and Look at This?" the Rodney King beating. But we can see, because we can see comments,
Right.
the way that other people are accepting and are consuming these images, in a celebratory way, in a funny way, etc. And some of us got a little bit out of that with the other Charleston riverboat incident. That should not have been as pleasurable for some of you, as it was with people wearing folding chair earrings and etc. throughout this day. That was a win-loss thing. So it's as if there is on the there's a score sheet, right? And that one side, as you say, this grievance gets so much that there's finally a moment of lick back, as the kids say. Y'all still see that, right? That there's a return to it, so another side gets to celebrate. So I did see another hand, so we'll go with Dr. Lee.
Thank you for this talk. I'm so excited to read the book. And as you were talking, I was thinking, the subtitle of the book is The Politics of Loss. And just as we were talking about the photographs and so many of your interventions, I was thinking about also the politics of exemplarity. So I wanted to ask you about that. And specifically, I'm just wondering whether or not, this is maybe like a two-part question, is exemplarity itself like a problem? Is it a thing that Black people come through already as like violated subjects? Right? Can we be exemplars of something else? And if the answer to that last question is no, that exemplarity is always sort of a problem, is there a way to think about politics without exemplars, without figures that organize our political world in the way that you just laid out, right? So we're looking at John Lewis or Stacey Abrams as exemplars of the salvaging of democracy. Trayvon Martin exemplifies racial violence, something else. All of those exemplars for you are problematic in various ways, and I agree. And so it's just making me think about exemplarity altogether, and whether or not that is an issue or something else. If that makes sense as a question.
Yeah, so I think one thing I would say that, if we're thinking about exemplarity, I think one of the problems with organizing or thinking about our politics along those lines is that, right, we tend to focus on, it's often been, right, charismatic male leaders, and it also, I think, is a bad way of thinking about movement politics, right? So if you think about social movements and the ways in which, we might want to think about collective thinking or think about who is a producer of knowledge, right? That those kind of models of politics can blind us to other places and where politics happen and to other people, right, who are important political actors. But I think the thing that I think in more than exemplarity, I think what I'm trying to argue against to some extent is this idea of redemptive suffering that has been so central to Black politics and has done enormous work, but that also, I think, creates this trap for Black politics. And I think one of the issues with it is that, the idea is, right, if you that if you take this, right, this injustice that happened to you and you respond to it in this exemplary way and you become a kind of heroic activist, that this will lead other people to empathize with your suffering, and this will fuel social change. But I think the problem is that it does kind of constrict, right, who Black people can be politically, right? Because then you have to be this, always the person who rises above the always civil protester, right? The person who is doing the heroic sacrifice to save U.S. democracy, right? And you don't get to be the people who take pleasure in the chairs being thrown in Charleston, right? And whatever we may think of that, it's about, for me, the project is about saying, how do we make space for Black people in their full humanity. Because we're not all heroes, we're not perfect, right? How do we make space for all of that, for the messy grief, for the, that doesn't become the exemplary activism, for the, the rage, or the anger, or whatever the range of those emotions are. And I think the problem with the, is that when it's not even with the exemplarity, but is that we tell these one-dimensional narratives, right? So we have a hard time telling stories about these folks who become, models that are multidimensional.
Professor Ford?
You got a question? You got a question before?
Everybody got a question.
Everybody got a question. So let's start with Mr. Brown there. Yes.
A lot of questions. Thank you first so much for coming to speak. Yeah, just one. I want to come back to kind of the conversation around whose losses we get to see and how kind of the conversation around being the perfect victim, but also the victim of the perfect kind of violence and all of these things. I see that as, and I think you talked about it earlier, but kind of the Black feminist critique, the Black queer critique of who does the Black community kind of prioritize in its conversation around movement building. I think that kind of my kind of experience with that, or my kind of studies have shown me that I think in response to that, oftentimes, I think back to very recently O'Shea Sibley, and the ways that kind of Black queer communities, virtually but also in person, found ways to celebrate him and mourn him and organize around him that wasn't necessarily in the same fashion as someone like Trayvon Martin, whose like case or whose kind of imagery tends to evoke this frustration and this kind of rage or frustration, or even just to focus on the incident rather than life. And so I'm wondering if, when we're talking about ways to recount Black lives or reanimate kind of Black victims in a way that's not only politically productive, but also sensitive and also mindful, I'm wondering if there's a way that kind of the people who've been left out of those conversations or left out of the mainstream have found ways to do it that are productive. And then I'm also wondering kind of if you could speak to the ethics of doing that, because I also think that there's this fear that, if we start trying to mourn every kind of Black victim of every kind of violence, then we're going to keep falling into the same pit trap of, they need to, this needs to ignite this political action. We need to focus on this incident, and everyone get lost in a lot of the same imagery that we're struggling to deal with now.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think, part of what I would say, and I feel like this is actually a Niles question from his work, is that there's a whole range of ways in which people have found ways to grieve. And so part of what I'm saying is not that, it's not that everyone has taken up this idea that you have to turn grief into grievance and move from grief into activism. But even though I do think that has been kind of the dominant expectation. And I think, there are these happy birthday videos of young men killed by police officers. And there's one that I cite in the book where they, on the anniversary of the birthdays, where they go and celebrate with the family and the community. And there's one of Philando Castile's family where they talk about how people are always asking them, what are you going to do? And they say, we're going to grieve, right? Like refusing that move to activism and just trying to celebrate his life. And so I think that part of I think that in a way there, I think there's this concept which just isn't mine. It's where he talks about despised mourners, and he talks about how people who have not been allowed to grieve, or whose grief hasn't been legible, right, have had to find creative ways to grieve, and he's writing specifically in part about AIDS activism. And so I think there's absolutely a way in which people have resisted those scripts and found different ways. And I think that the issue is, how do you, is for me in part, right, it's not to say, is not to deny the power or to criticize the people who become activists in the wake of losing a loved one to try to get justice for them. But it's to say, how do we open up the range of ways that we find acceptable, that we legitimize the range of responses and the range of ways of grieving that might not look like, what you think it should, right? And I think that's again important for so it's not about, saying, oh, you should never, you should instrumentalizing, let's say, grief is always a problem. It's like, what's the wrong kind of way to instrumentalize it? Or, but I also think that your question gets at this issue too of the sort of unending cycle, right? Of having to always have something else to grieve and to contend with. That is part, I think, of the loss that Black people live with every day.
Let's go to Professor Fort and Gritty. Taking the tandem.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for this wonderful project. I also have tons of questions, but we can talk more later. So let's see. So I'm really happy that you're making the argument about Black grief, refusing Black grief to be a sort of repair for the pitfalls of American democracy. And I'm wondering if, and the refusal to easily instrumentalize Black grief into action. So I'm wondering about is there a world-making project to the grief that you're talking about? And is politics as a category enough to tell us about what that world-making might look like? And aside, like, sort of connected to that, like, is there an instrumentalizing that's not external? And is that still political, or are we in a different terrain like ethics or something else? Does that make sense? Like, what does grief do that is potentially valuable for Black people, for the world, and what terrain is that on? Is it escaping politics? Is it a part of politics? Do we need more than politics? Like that kind of.
Well, yeah, that's, are we taking both? We're taking both, right?
Yeah, but that's a big
yeah, so I think part of what I would say is that the question of what grief can do for Black people is a different question than the question of what grief can do for U.S. democracy, right? And I would distinguish between those. And I agree with you that if we're focusing on what grief can do for Black people, that it is not simply about this category of the political, which is, one realm. I mean, and I try to get at this to a certain extent, although that's not my question, by looking at the ways in which people like Wells, people like Jacobs, others are sort of attending to Black life and not just to Black death, right? So when I write about, for example, incidents, there are all of these ways in which, mourning is working through that text. Jacobs is mourning all kinds of losses, and people are mourning with her, and that was, incredibly radical and important in a system like slavery that did not allow enslaved people literal, room to grieve, right? So Jacobs doesn't get to attend the funeral of her father because her enslaver doesn't even occur to her that she might want to actually be able to go to her father's funeral. And so there is a way in which those moments of grieving collectively, right? When, for example, her Aunt Nancy dies and her uncle, who has freed himself, right? Her grandmother, his mother, has paid for his freedom after paying for her own. So material dispossession upon material dispossession. He pays for the funeral. And one way to read it right now is to say, oh my God, this is another instance of further dispossession of Black people. But it obviously meant something to be able to put on a good funeral. And she writes about it, right? That if a white Northerner watching this would have given credit to the enslavers and said, look how much they cared for the enslaved people. But she said, in fact, I could have told them a tale of woe about how they actually killed her aunt. But at the same time, she is talking about how they did this act of care for her, even in death. So I think part of it is thinking about the ways in which Black people are caring for each other, are caring in community, and they're doing so not just for the living, but for the dead.
Dr. Hooker, I'm looking forward to reading the book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I have two questions. One is straightforward. I wonder if you could describe the Senegalese photo, which seemed to be the one of the Senegalese brothers. So that's one, just because I'm just curious to see what this scene actually is. Then the second one is, I think, semi-incoherent, but I'm going to just give it a shot. I'm wondering if, and maybe you get into this in the book, I'm wondering if what you've been so eloquently critiquing as this form of mobilization of politics is particular to a certain kind of Black liberal politics. And I'm not invested in liberal conservative, I'm actually not, but for the sake of this question, I am going to be. That what we're seeing here, in fact, is this kind of narrative strategy of liberalism that Black folk have used, from before the 50s and 60s until the present, that sort of got revived with Obamaism, right? But that there is a way in which there's all these other ways that Black movements, as you know, have mobilized people, right? That have not used that sort of that technique of mobilization, appealing to white empathy or whatever it is. And so I'm wondering if that's true. I know radical movements have done that, but at the same time, if I think about the Black Panthers, we have groups in the '60s that are they're acknowledging death, but they're kind of responding with a whole array of other images of empowerment or revolution, whatever it may be. And so I'm wondering, it seems to me this is very particular to a certain kind of liberal politics. So like the images of Bois and Abrams again is in that tradition, and that what marks the limits of the movements of these days is that they're participating in this kind of old strategy, which in an era of encroaching fascism doesn't really work anymore in the way that it might have in the 60s. Maybe. I know that's just a semi-incoherent question.
I don't think it's incoherent, because one of the things that I was thinking is that the focus on democracy and American democracy is what shifted me out of, because I didn't have the same thought, right? Is that we're not talking,
Because even like Garveyism in the 20s,
Right,
Garveyism was emerging in the moment of the lynching and all this, but they're not even doing any stuff at all.
Right.
They're just singing the Ethiopian national anthem. They've got a whole array of response to racial terror and the oppression that people are feeling, whether it's in Central America or in the U.S. You see what I mean? I mean, there's various forms of Black mobilization that are not engaging in kind of strategy.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think that you're right to say that it is. I think it is a particular liberal strategy, right? This idea that that the way to move forward is to sort of bring the kind of white public on your side, and then you can get a kind of transformation. That's a particular liberal reformist approach. That's not the approach of, let's say, Black nationalists or, Garveyites or others who are envisioning a different, who are not even constrained by the idea of Miss Democracy, right? So they're thinking in terms of transnational diasporic communities, and I think that is perhaps part of what allows them not to fall into some of these patterns. I think the interesting thing, is to think about how this move, though, has retained its kind of historical relevance, right? So thinking about, how we have been so quick, for example, to understand police violence in terms of lynching, right? As the sort of, historical metaphor that makes sense, or the historical precedent that makes sense. That there's a way in which and I think there's a story that we tell ourselves about the civil rights movement, which is also a problem, right? That gives us this very liberal, account of the civil rights movement that makes it much more monolithic, and that really erases the diversity of strategies, of ideological positions in that moment in Black politics, where even within the civil rights movement, think about the civil rights movement and then Black power, that there's a whole range of positions being articulated. But when you look at how people write about civil disobedience and Black protest, it's often in terms of this very romanticized account of the civil rights movement as these very civil, nonviolent protesters, and then they changed white hearts and minds, and it was all very, not conflicted. They were not confrontational, which of course is absolutely not the case. We all know, right, that even civil disobedience is all about confrontation, right? It's about making the tension visible. So I think it is perhaps particular to kind of strand of Black liberalism, but it's also the fact that we even tell sanitized versions of what those movements look like, that emphasize those moves even more.
So, if there isn't another burning question, why don't you join me in thanking Professor Hooker for this important work and for this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good night. We have here, so I'm supposed to, this is one of the reasons I put this here. We were so clever to do it, I almost didn't tell you. There's our CR code that you can go to find all of our wonderful events at the Institute for Research in African American Studies and find out what's on this spring. Great things are coming up. I won't even tell you, just go to the CR code. Thanks again.